I ended up doing a PhD in origin of life biology within a history and philosophy of science department in Cambridge.
Do you believe in evolution?
I believe in microevolution. I believe that there are real evolutionary processes. I'm skeptical about what's called universal common descent, the idea that all living forms have evolved from one single common ancestor. I happen to be a believing biblical Christian. I believe the Bible's witness. There were reports that he had appeared to many after being resurrected. So there's a whole...
Right, but there's reports of Bigfoot.
There were many early Christians who died claiming to have seen the resurrected Jesus. People do not give their lives for a factual claim that they know to be false.
A few weeks back, Joe Rogan had intelligent design advocate and Christian apologist Dr. Stephen Meyer on his podcast. I'm not a regular viewer or fan of Joe Rogan, but I did tune into this episode. I thought Joe asked some very interesting questions and clearly tried to gently challenge Meyer's ideas in several places. But some of Meyer's points went unchallenged to the detriment of the educational value of the episode. So, my friend John Perry and I decided to take on 2 points Meyer made, which we found both dubious and insufficiently challenged in the episode. John is a professional science educator who works with scientists to produce animated educational videos for classrooms and the general public. You might already know him from his awesome YouTube channels, Stated Clearly and Stated Casually. The guy spends a lot of time explaining the intricacies of evolution, so he's going to take on a claim which Meyer made about the field of evolutionary biology. I'll be back in just a bit to tackle another one of Meyer's claims. First, though, let me ask you guys a question. In these categories, political bias, factuality, and ownership, how would you rate my content? Personally, I'd probably say left political bias, mixed or high factuality, depending on the type of video, opinion piece, or educational, and finally, independently owned. Would you agree? And wouldn't it be helpful to critical thinkers watching if an independent team did publicly rate content in this way? I ask because the main way I consume news content incorporates this rating system, which allows me to compare and think critically about the sources I'm reading. If you haven't figured it out yet, I'm talking about the excellent app and website, also this video's sponsor, Ground News. They aggregate news from thousands of sources, show you political bias, ownership of news outlets, and factual reliability all up front. Here's a story that seems a bit polarizing. Judge tosses Trump's defamation suit against writer who won sexual abuse lawsuit against him. So Ground News summarizes the story for me up top, but also on every single source gives me a rating for factuality, political bias, and the locality of the news source. You can see that left-leaning sources like to report this one, and right-leaning sources, not so much. After I compare sources on all these factors, then I like to start reading. This is legitimately how I get my news in everyday life, and it saved me from falling into an echo chamber many times, so I highly recommend you try out Ground News too. To check it out and support my channel in the process, click the link in the description or pinned comment. That's ground.news/skeptic to try out Ground News. Okay, sponsorship over. Take it away, John.
All right. The Stephen Meyer, Joe Rogan podcast. Most of what was said on there is actually probably totally fine. Stephen Meyer was talking about his own personal beliefs and his experience with his faith and so on. That's totally fine. Another thing that he did on there was he talked about several unsolved mysteries within the field of evolutionary biology. Again, that's totally fine. There are genuine mysteries, especially surrounding the origin of life. If you watch Stated Clearly animations about the origin of life, I talk about them all the time. These unsolved mysteries. The thing that was frustrating for me and other educators to hear is that he continually said things that are just false. There's a bunch of things we do understand in evolutionary biology that he claims we don't. For example, he claimed that we don't know how new genetic information evolves. We do understand how new genetic information evolves. We first really started getting a grasp of this back in the 70s, late 60s, early 70s. We now understand this process extremely well. If you want to learn more about this, I've got an entire series about it on the Stated Clearly channel. How does new genetic information evolve? One of the claims that he made that's relatively new here, or at least it's one that I've never addressed specifically anywhere else, is this claim that he made about a meeting back in 2016.
I attended a conference in 2016 at convened by the Royal Society in London, the Royal Society being the oldest and most august scientific body in the world. And it was convened by a group of evolutionary biologists who were essentially dissatisfied with neo-Darwinism, the standard textbook theory that we learn in all high school and college textbooks, and many of them were saying we need a new theory of evolution.
The way Stephen talks about that meeting just dramatically distorts the true nature of that conference. First, I think it's probably worth asking the question, is it normal for scientists to meet and debate the foundational concepts and theories in their specific field of research? The answer to this question is yes. This is a completely normal part of the scientific process. It happens in every field: physics, chemistry, astronomy. Probably the most famous, the most infamous example of this is from back in 2006. It was at the General Assembly of the International Astronomical Union. They debated about the definition of a planet. A bunch of new objects in space in our solar system had been discovered. Some of them were really big, planet-like. And so people were talking about, what's the best way to think about a planet? How should we actually define what planets are and what planets are not? As a result of those debates, the definition of a planet was changed, and Pluto was demoted from being a planet to being a, quote, dwarf planet. And that made a lot of people very angry. When scientists get together to debate foundational concepts in their fields, things can get obnoxious. Sometimes there's name-calling, there's yelling, often followed by temper tantrums when being interviewed by journalists afterwards. This stuff can look extremely petty, extremely childish from an outsider's view looking in. But these really are normal parts of the scientific process, and being petty and being childish and being obnoxious, that's a thing that people do, even in very otherwise professional settings. The 2016 meeting that Stephen is referring to was one of these types of conferences. The title of that conference was New Trends in Evolutionary Biology. The entire thing was recorded. You can listen to each talk, including some of the spicy debates and the Q&A sections after each talk, and you can see those over on the Royal Society's website. Totally free. Now, if you ignore the pettiness in some of those presentations, it's not hard to understand the meat of the issue that was being debated. Those who called for the meeting, they were upset about the field's current obsession with genes. Back in the good old days, scientists were able to learn all sorts of things about evolution without any reference to those pesky gene things. Darwin and his colleagues, they studied evolution by just comparing traits of different organisms, not the genes, just the traits. So this included traits found in fossilized critters, living plants, and animals, closely related animals. You compare their different traits and you can kind of piece together how those evolved. A lot of this research was done by studying embryos, and especially comparing the embryos of different organisms to each other, the developmental pathways that embryos undergo. In the 1940s, the concept of a gene started to really solidify and become popular among scientists. In the 50s and 60s, when DNA's structure was described and the standard genetic code was cracked, the gene took center stage at almost every scientific conference, every conference about biology, and it soaked up almost all the research money available for evolutionary biologists. It captured huge amounts of space in biology textbooks. It eventually even captured the heart of Hollywood with movies like Jurassic Park. Some people nicknamed this rise of the popularity of the gene within the field of evolutionary biology as the, quote, modern synthesis. This is because scientists had supposedly synthesized or smashed together what Darwin and early workers figured out about evolution with what Gregor Mendel and other geneticists learned about genes. This focus on the gene has undeniably led to huge breakthroughs in evolutionary biology, but many of the speakers at that 2016 conference complained that our hyper-focus on the gene had also given us huge blind spots that can be immediately remedied, so they claim, if we simply look again at things like embryology. Stephen Meyer explained none of this to Joe Rogan. Instead, he went on to say the following.
The first talk at that conference was given by Gerd Müller, a prominent Austrian evolutionary biologist, and he simply enumerated the five major, what he called explanatory deficits of neo-Darwinism. And his basic perspective was the mutation selection mechanism does a good job of optimizing or modifying pre-existing forms. It can generate small-scale variation, but it does a very poor job of explaining the origin of those forms.
Now, Gerd Mueller, he did word things sort of similar to the way that Stephen explained there, but if you actually listen to Gerd's entire talk, you realize that with full context, just full context of that talk alone, the meat of Gerd's actual argument is radically different from what Stephen leads you to believe. First off, Gerd does not complain about, quote, neo-Darwinism. In fact, that term, neo-Darwinism, it doesn't really have a solid definition. Instead, Gerd complains about the modern synthesis. And I would argue that Gerd is actually complaining about a straw man version of the modern synthesis. Some of the things he claims in that talk are pretty silly. If you look at gene sequences only, if you never study how those genes actually go about making three-dimensional bodies in the three-dimensional world, there are certain questions about evolution that seem impossible to solve. These are questions that are actually super easy to solve when you take embryology into account. As an example of this, he points to a body of research surrounding domestic cats. Wild cats and most domestic cat breeds have 5 fingers, or claws, if you'd rather, on their front paws. Some cat breeds, however, have 6 fully developed fingers on each paw. How did an entire new finger evolve with muscles and tendons and everything? If you hold a cartoonishly simple gene-based view of evolution, and Gerd suggests in that talk that this is what all biologists think, and it's definitely not what all biologists think. He's being hyperbolic here, but if you just imagine a really stupid biologist who holds a very cartoonishly simple view of evolution, that guy, he would probably think that it would require thousands of new mutations to make an entirely new cat finger. Those mutations, this geneticist might think, would have needed to accumulate gradually through careful selection over thousands of generations. Some mutations would involve making new bone structures. Others would be for tendon formation, tendon placement, muscle, claw, skin, and toe pad development, and so on. It might seem to this naive geneticist that breeding for cats with 6 fingers would be a nearly impossible project spanning thousands of years. In reality, because of the way finger development works in mammals, it turns out that all you really need is one mutation that changes the timing of paw growth early during embryological development. There are several different mutations we now know can cause this to happen. And when this timing shift is triggered by a mutation, an entirely new finger, so we're talking muscles, tendons, bones, everything, all of that will form automatically as a result. Stephen Meyer quote mines Gerd's talk to make it seem like scientists have no idea how evolution works. Gerd did not claim that we are desperate for a fundamentally new theory of evolution. Instead, he claimed that because discoveries in embryology and several other subfields of research are shedding so much light on how particular traits evolve, he thinks we should rename the modern theory of evolution. Gerd proposed we call it, quote, the extended evolutionary synthesis. Scientists from the audience during that conference agreed with him that things like embryology and plasticity are really important concepts in evolutionary biology, but they're already in our textbooks. These things are taught in high school classrooms. Biologists in general already understand them. They see no good reason to rebrand the field of evolutionary biology. Drew, back to you, my friend.
Why did I put John first? That means I now have to follow that. Great. All right, I'm going to try my best. Hopefully you guys enjoy my part too. A few times in the podcast, Meyer made claims about religious psychology. Since psychology was my major in college and I often discuss psych research in my videos, I'm going to focus on those claims. We'll begin with Rogan asking Meyer a question about how an understanding of the psychological tendencies of humans affects his view of the Bible and its authors.
How do you reconcile with the reality that the Bible was written down, at least, by human beings, and that human beings are generally unreliable? At least in terms of 100% accuracy, and also inclined to manipulate each other, especially when they're in control of large groups of people, and also inclined to appease the instincts and the desires and needs of their followers. So they create texts that resonate with the people and develop a philosophy that resonates with the people. And if they say that it comes from God itself, especially if it resonates, especially if it makes sense, and maybe perhaps it is in some way from God because it is coming from this divine inspiration. But how do we know?
Your question embedded an interesting insight about motivation, that we have confirmation bias, we have all these these things. And in this basic discussion about God between, say, the new atheists who aren't so new anymore and people more on our side of the worldview divide, there's a tendency to point fingers about motivations. Oh, you religious people believe this stuff because it gives you comfort. And the religious argument to the atheists is, so you atheist materialists, you disbelieve because it gives you moral freedom. You don't have to be accountable to a moral judge. And I think in each person there's that push-pull. There's motivations to believe, there's motivations not to believe. And one of the benefits of philosophical training is the attempt, at least, to extricate debates from those motivations. You know, they're essentially ad hominem arguments, and try to avoid those as much as possible on both sides.
Meyer is touching on an idea that is important. When speaking to an individual with which you disagree, definitively asserting that their beliefs are wholly explained by biases stemming from their motivations or emotions is reductive. You can't always be certain of that, and it's insulting. The famous Christian theologian C.S. Lewis gave a name to this practice. He called it bulverism, and rightly stated that it can get in the way of productive conversation. With that said, Rogan's question about the Bible was not an exercise in bulverism. Rather, he raised the possibility that known patterns of religious psychology and phenomenology played a role in shaping the Bible, then asked what Meyer thought about that possibility. Meyer's response equivocates this with outright bulverism, and if you watch the episode from this point carefully, you see that Meyer never addresses Rogan's question. Instead, he shifted the conversation toward arguments about the historicity of the Gospels, a topic which Christian apologists have done significantly more work on than religious psychology. There was another false equivalence in Meyer's statement. The claim religious belief is often motivated by comfort, and the claim disbelief is motivated by desire to sin, are not based on equivalent justification. The latter, as a sociological claim, is not empirically supported. Literature in the fields of psychology and sociology, which focuses on reasons people leave Christianity, for example, does not suggest a desire for moral freedom as a motivating factor. In fact, when moral issues do motivate disassociation from Christianity, those moral issues are typically concern with moral hypocrisy of Christians and having to do the right thing, even at considerable cost. Although, as the article I've been quoting here states, intellectual doubt was a primary motivation for deconversion. Now, Christian apologists typically defend this people disbelieve because they want to sin claim with appeals to theology. They may explain that the scientific literature I've cited misses the fact that disbelievers suppress the truth in unrighteousness, and that even those who honestly believe themselves to doubt Christianity for intellectual reasons may only do so because God has given up their soul or spirit. This enables the person to enter a spiritually blind state where they are unable to recognize that the real reason they disbelieve is their own moral failure. Or put more simply,
there are some people out there who genuinely don't believe God exists because they've suppressed the truth so long that God has given up to their own desires, and they're at the end of Romans 1 rather than the beginning. They've lost the capacity to recognize God exists because God knows they're never coming back and he has given them up.
I've made a whole video responding to this claim, by the way. It's linked in the cards and description. You might see the issue here. When we involve concepts which can't be tied to empirical observation or which are infinitely powerful or malleable in definition, concepts like the soul, spirit, and God, study through observation becomes impossible. With these concepts in play, anything we've ever observed can be made to fit a prior conclusion, and any model of the thing we're trying to study, in this case the psychological process, becomes impossible to test and therefore meaningless. Theological concepts like these cannot be invoked to defend a claim about observable phenomena without making explanatory models of observable phenomena absurd or useless. Okay, what about the claim religious belief is often motivated by comfort? Does that find empirical support in the literature? To a significant degree, yes. I've made a video previously which explores this in greater depth, so I'll link that in the description and show you a brief clip here. In their book, Sacred and Secular, Religion and Politics Worldwide, political scientists Pippa Norris and Ronald Inglehart develop a theory of existential security as it relates to religious belief and practice. They suggest that religion is a tool with which people cope with existential threats, which is why trauma and poverty seem to motivate religious behavior. Religion becomes less central as people's lives become less vulnerable to the constant threat of death, disease, and misfortune. As lives gradually become more comfortable and secure, people in more affluent societies usually grow increasingly indifferent to religious values, more skeptical of supernatural beliefs, and less willing to become actively engaged in religious institutions. So, all this to say, Meyer's statement that
They're essentially ad hominem arguments.
is incorrect, and, however unintentionally, allowed him to dismiss Rogan's question. Okay, when I was first listening to this episode and I heard Meyer say this, everything I just discussed was running through my head, but it wasn't until a few more minutes in that I decided I had to address how Meyer handles religious psychology. Let's skip ahead to the discussion of Meyer's belief in the resurrection of Jesus from the dead.
The Josephus text is much more credible, where he records the basic facts of the life and death of Jesus of Nazareth, including being crucified under Pontius Pilate. And then that there were reports that he had appeared to many after being resurrected. So there's a whole...
Right, but there's reports of Bigfoot.
Well, right, but...
Right, but this is an extraordinary event, right?
Right.
You're talking about a resurrection of a
Right.
person who died and
Right.
came back
Right.
and was the Son of God. This is a big claim.
Yeah, it is a big claim. What historians must do is evaluate the reliability of historical testimony if what's coming is historical testimony.
Mm-hmm.
One piece of historical testimony that's always been extremely compelling to me is the testimony of James, who is mentioned in the New Testament as one of the witnesses to whom Jesus appeared after the alleged resurrection event. We also then know from Josephus that James was stoned to death, martyred for his witness to the resurrection. Now, there's a kind of very simple argument, but it goes back to one of the early Christian writers, Eusebius, saying that people will lie to get out of trouble. They do it all the time. We see it in our politics. But people don't lie to get into trouble.
We're just assuming that they would let him lie or do anything to get out of trouble.
There were many early Christians who died claiming to have seen the resurrected Jesus. I think this is an example of, okay, here's an historical claim. How can we evaluate the reliability of that witness? People will give their lives for an abstract philosophy that they believe to be true. People do not give their lives for a factual claim that they know to be false. That's lying to get into trouble.
So, within Meyer's argument for the resurrection of Jesus, he makes a claim about religious psychology, that people don't die for a factual claim they know to be false. This raises the question, why can he dismiss psychology in the previous case, but not this one? Clearly, discussing the reliability of historical testimony is necessary to best discern truth at times. Why is it acceptable for him to discuss the psychology of the Christian martyrs in order to serve a Christian narrative, but not acceptable to analyze the psychology of biblical authors or their devotees? This is quite inconsistent on Meyer's part. On top of this inconsistency, this argument is... As we well know, and Meyer acknowledges, people do in fact die for ideology. Even people of different mutually exclusive ideologies have been willing to die for them, and since mutually exclusive ideologies can't both be true, that means some people have been willing to die for ideologies they honestly believed, but were actually false. Meyer does something clever with his wording to avoid this point, though.
People will give their lives for an abstract philosophy that they believe to be true. People do not give their lives for a factual claim that they know to be false.
Here, Meyer makes a distinction between believing in abstract ideology and believing a factual claim. But he also introduces two premises with his wording that are easy to miss. 1. If the resurrection of Jesus didn't really happen, but the Christian martyrs died for it anyway, they died for a factual claim which they knew was false. 2. The Christian martyrs were killed for believing in the resurrection of Jesus, not for ideology or political actions adjacent to that belief. Let's address these ideas one at a time. First off, religious ideologies which Meyer both believes are false and acknowledges people have died for, like Islam, contain what Meyer calls factual claims. It is a factual claim that God inspired the Quran through Muhammad in the 7th century CE, a belief which all Muslim martyrs likely held. According to Meyer's reasoning, this means that claim is true, which would imply Christianity is likely false. Differentiating between abstract ideology and a factual claim here is a distinction without a difference. Abstract ideologies are usually intertwined with so-called factual claims, and treating them as completely distinct obfuscates the issue here. Now to address Meyer's two sneaky premises here. The first was that if the resurrection of Jesus didn't really happen, the Christian martyrs died for a claim they knew was false. This attempts to avoid the rather obvious notion that the Christian martyrs were simply mistaken about the resurrection of Jesus, but firm enough in their conviction to die for it. Like we've discussed already, people can and do die for sincerely held beliefs, which are actually false. Human memory is so malleable that people can honestly recount events in their lives that never actually happened, as psychologist Dr. Elizabeth Loftus explains in this clip.
Memory is actually more of a constructive process. When we remember something, we're actually taking bits and pieces of experience, bringing them together to essentially construct what feels like an actual memory. So I like to say that memory works a little bit more like a Wikipedia page, because you can go in there and edit it, but so can other people. If you ask somebody, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? You're going to get a higher estimate of speed, on the average, than if you ask a question with a more neutral verb like hit. How fast were the cars going when they hit each other? The early questions could affect the answer that people gave to some totally different question that you put to them often much later. So if I ask you how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other, later on you're more likely to tell me you saw broken glass at the scene, even though there wasn't any broken glass.
Knowing this about memory, it's no stretch whatsoever to reason that someone mistakenly believed they saw a risen Jesus, and as Jesus followers discussed this sighting, more people constructed false but sincerely believed memories of their own sightings. The second of Meyer's sneaky premises was that the Christian martyrs were killed specifically for believing in the resurrection of Jesus. What is more likely, though, is that they were killed for political reasons. To many Roman rulers, those who drastically deviated from religious norms, especially those who refused to sacrifice to the gods of the state, represented a force for political and social instability. Many Christian martyrs probably were not killed for believing a guy rose from the dead, but for representing a potentially destabilizing force in the Roman Empire. Scholars of classical and Christian history have thought this for decades and decades now. Check out the resources in the description to learn more. So, this argument of Meyer's makes a distinction without a difference, contains reasoning which could be used to undermine Meyer's own beliefs, attempts to avoid a simpler explanation for Christian martyrdom based on established research and memory, and implies a false historical narrative. The precise wording of the argument was clever, though, as it snuck in enough premises to make it very difficult and time-consuming to unpack. Like many other professional religious apologists, Meyer has quite a skill in wrapping poor arguments in brilliantly convoluted rhetoric. Finally, I'd like to return to the topic of religious psychology. As regular viewers of mine might remember, in a previous video I explained anthropologist Dr. Joseph Henrich's theory of credibility-enhancing displays. This is a theory of how beliefs are formed with strong implications for religious belief formation, and it's backed by some decent empirical support. For a fuller picture of the theory, watch my video on it, but for now, here are two clips of Dr. Henrich explaining it. Listen closely, and it will become obvious why I've brought it up.
If you think about this from an evolutionary perspective, we can think about natural selection shaping our minds to make us better cultural learners. So you can see this in some obvious ways in the way the youngest children and babies learn. They tend to pay attention to people who are more successful or more competent or more reliable. So from a young age, kids are cluing in on this. But when we heavily rely on learning from others, it opens up the possibility of exploitation. So somebody could pass us bad information, say about what to eat. They could tell us we should eat something that they don't want to eat, so that there's more of the food for them, for example. So the idea was that learners might evolve a kind of immune system to this. And one way to make them immune is they'll only learn from people who, when they try to pass on a belief to them, which is going to involve costly behavior, that the person themselves engages in the costly behavior, so that they see someone demonstrate that they actually believe in it. And I call this a credibility enhancing display, or cred. So if your religion requires, say, religious leaders, priests, whatever the relevant category is, to engage in costly displays, this could be food taboos, vows of poverty, sacrifice, walking on hot coals. So there's a whole wide array of these things that you see across the world in different religions. That makes them a more effective transmitter. Because when you see someone engage in one of these costly things like celibacy, that doesn't seem like something someone would do unless they really believe the underlying supernatural beliefs. I mean, if you look at the role of martyrdom in religions, Jesus or the early Christian martyrs martyr themselves and they're willing to die for their beliefs. That's persuasive to a learner that this person really believed in heaven or whatever they were preaching.
So martyrdom essentially being the ultimate
it's the ultimate
enhancing
cred.
display.
It's
Yeah, the ultimate cred. Interesting.
Yeah. This theory posits that people are evolutionarily predisposed to accept the claims or beliefs of martyrs, like the Christian martyrs, and even Jesus himself, the ultimate martyr. This is not a rational process, but rather a feature of cognition that we all share. No wonder, then, so many, even highly educated people believe extraordinary claims when those claims have their own martyrs. But is it Bulverism to state this? Am I attacking the character of Christian believers just for presenting this scientific theory as credible? Based on what we've heard from Stephen Meyer, perhaps he would say yes. But would you? I'll leave you and religious apologists like Meyer with this question. When your interlocutor presents scientific findings which contradict your beliefs, when is this an attack, persecution, or censorship of your group? And when is this an opportunity to humbly admit you were wrong? Whew, I feel like this turned into a pretty technical discussion. For a more casual, long-form discussion of this podcast, check out my conversation with John over on his channel Stated Casually. We discussed a lot more than just the science involved, but also the ethics and cultural impact of platforming figures like Stephen Meyer. Definitely go check that out. Thank you for watching. I've been Drew of Genetically Modified Skeptic. A huge thank you to John Perry for collaborating with me on this. I couldn't have done this without you, man, so thank you. You guys should definitely subscribe to both of his channels. Another thank you to my patrons for their constant love and support. If you want to hear more from me, then subscribe. As always, if you are an apostate in need, there are resources linked in the description to help you find community and mental health support. Remember to be kind to others in the comments, and until next time, stay skeptical.